of America's largest health insurers, Anthem Inc., disclosed in early 2015 that hackers had stolen personal information on more than 80 million of its customers. These hackers gained access to a wealth of personal data, including names, birthdays, medical IDs, social security numbers, street addresses, email addresses, and employment information, including income. The massive data breach was one of the largest in American history at the time, and it was different from most cybercrimes that came before it. Although the identity of the hackers might never be conclusively determined, some news reports linked the data theft to the Chinese government. So the motivation, insofar as we can discern it, was not for profit or other financial gain. Rather, the Anthem attack seemed to be an instance of surveillance of American citizens by a foreign government through cyber means. And that's the subject of this lecture. We typically focus on the question of a government's surveillance of its own citizens. At least here in the United States, that has been seen as the pressing political and moral question. But our discussion of surveillance would be incomplete if we did not include consideration of how we might be subject to observation by those outside of our borders. After all, one country's espionage is another country's surveillance, just by a different name. Indeed, given the size of the Anthem breach, it might not be an exaggeration to say that more Americans have had their personal privacy violated by the Chinese government than by any other single entity in the world, which is a conclusion that ought to give us pause. And so it seems useful to look at surveillance from that perspective. In this lecture, we're going to talk about three aspects of the issue. First, we'll ask why foreign surveillance might be more common today in cyberspace. What is it about the domain that enables surveillance? Second, we will take a brief look at how cyber intrusions and surveillance happen. And third, we'll step back and ask what this all means in terms of surveillance of Americans. Only a few years ago, the topic of foreign surveillance on American soil would have been a subject of little concern. Such spycraft, when it occurred, would have been limited to instances of physical or electronic surveillance that were relatively few and far between. This was mostly because virtually all personal surveillance requires a physical presence in the United States as a condition of successful action. You couldn't be a spy without being in the country you're spying against. Today, that paradigm has changed. The Internet telescopes time and space. It allows almost instantaneous action at a distance. And that's a sea change in our conception of surveillance. Viewed another way, the history of human interaction is essentially one of increasing distance at which our interactions occur. Take armed conflict, for example. Early in human history, conflict required physical proximity. Think of Romans fighting at sword length apart from the invading Visigoths, and you have an idea of how close you had to be in order to fight a war back in ancient times. Likewise, the sale of goods in the ancient economy. The buyer and the seller had to come physically together to trade goods. And as for malicious acts such as theft or murder, the perpetrator had to be physically close, either to the victim or to the victim's property. So too with espionage and surveillance. The spy had to actually break into someone's office and steal the secret plans, for example. Over time, the necessity for close proximity has weakened. Cyberspace is a quantum leap in that direction. Action in the cyber domain occurs at the speed of light and crosses immense distances almost instantaneously. From your desktop, at the mere flick of a finger, you can access a website in Japan, read a South American newspaper, or make reservations at a restaurant in Paris. But what is easy for you from your home computer is also easy for any malicious actor who wants access to that computer or the networks it operates on. Whether the object is warfare, terrorism, espionage, or crime, it is no longer necessary for the malevolent actor to be anywhere near their objective. One incident that makes the point. That is, the discovery of malicious software, probably from China, though nobody's quite certain, found on the computer of the U.S. Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert Gates. In earlier times, if a Chinese spy, or perhaps it was a Russian spy, had wanted to get access to the office of the Secretary of Defense, he or she would have had to pass through several checkpoints at the gates of the Pentagon and surreptitiously made their way into his inner sanctum in the E-ring of the building. By virtue of the structure of the Internet, the malicious actor was, in this instance, able to penetrate Secretary Gates' computer from a distance that effectively put him or her beyond our reach. As a consequence of all this, America today is more vulnerable to foreign surveillance and espionage than ever before. Foreign watchers can, in effect, peer over our shoulders, safe in their homes, behind their own borders. So, how does a foreign government get into your computer, or Anthem's computer in the first place? Typically, the attack arrives through an email message, or some other innocent form of communication. You might have gotten one of those really suspicious emails yourself. You know the ones, right? They come from someone in your address book, and you're in the sender's address book as well. And often the message consists of just a website address, a hyperlink that you can click on. I got one just the other day which helpfully said, "Open the attachment." Such links will take you to web pages where embedded malware lives, and that could be the start of your computer being compromised. More than 200 billion emails are sent every day, some of which are the source for roughly 150 million different phishing attacks. They're called phishing, by the way, with a PH, because the bad link is the bait, and you are, I'm afraid, the fish. Even if only a teeny fraction of a percentage of these attacks succeed, it still means that a massive number of people are affected by these types of attacks. Still, that kind of simplistic attack is not what a moderately cautious, sophisticated user should be afraid of. So let's look at a more subtle form of attack, a malicious intrusion that goes by the name of a Trojan horse, or more simply, a Trojan. They're called Trojans because typically the malware is hidden inside a program that looks like an innocent piece of information, just like the famous Trojan horse that had Greek soldiers hidden inside of it. To understand how this type of cyber intrusion works is, in some ways, pretty technical, a complexity that reflects the intricacy of these types of attacks. But if you follow along, we can unpack some of the jargon and understand what is happening in a typical attack. Usually, an attack begins with the simple Trojan communication. Often it is just an email to someone. This is often called a spear phishing email because it targets a specific individual or recipient, much like a spear used to catch a particular fish. Instead of a generic message that fits almost anyone, it will have a message designed specifically for you or a narrow targeted group. The other day, for example, I got one that purported to have a link to a news article about the president's cybersecurity policy proposals. Now, these spear phishing emails are designed to appear as though they come from an innocent source, but they'll have a malicious program hidden within, either in the email itself or quite possibly in an attachment. When the unsuspecting recipient clicks on the attachment, the malware begins the automated download of a controller program. This program then opens a backdoor communications channel, allowing outside individuals to access the programs that control the target systems. When the communications open up, the attackers flood the system, much like a tank brigade moving through the breach in a defensive line. Some of the attackers create new breaches. Others use their position to promote themselves within the system and give themselves authority to access all of the data that's available. If it's a quick hit-and-run attack, They begin removing information from the target system, like your login codes or financial data. In short, the simple email cracks open the security of the target, and then a team of cyber specialists exploit the defensive gap. The intrusion doesn't have to be a quick hit and run. There's another class of attacks that are sometimes called generically Advanced Persistent Threats, or APTs. These are intrusions that are developed over time using sophisticated attack methodologies that are directed at specific targets. Think of them, if you will, as the guided missiles of cyberspace. Once inside a system, the APT might stay resident in the target for a long period of time, and in effect make the target computer vulnerable to continuous monitoring from the outside. These types of intrusions are common forms of surveillance operated by foreign governments, and, I should say, doubtless by our own government overseas. To see how these APTs work, let's look at one of the most famous surveillance programs in cyber history, one called GhostNet. GhostNet was found back in 2008, running on the computers operated by the offices of the Dalai Lama. It began with malware hidden in an email that was addressed from a trusted source, freetibet.org, and which contained a real document, a directory of Friends of Tibet. It looked completely innocent, but it contained a Trojan horse program that avoided the Dalai Lama's intrusion detection system to insert itself into the operating system of the Dalai Lama's servers. This program, in turn, communicated with controller servers operated by someone outside of the Dalai Lama's organization. These remote operators used the new malicious software to take control of the Dalai Lama's computer system. Acting remotely, the installers could, for example, turn on a keystroke logger. A logger, as its name implies, is a program that captures all of the keystrokes entered on the keyboard attached to the computer. In this case, the laptops and keyboards in the Dalai Lama's office. Imagine what that means, for example, if an official within the Dalai Lama's organization was typing in the password to an account at the Bank of India. Those who controlled the malicious software were also able to remotely turn on the video cameras and microphones on the computers in the offices of the Dalai Lama. Using the camera and microphone, the surveillors could see and hear anything that was happening within range of the computer. And they did this without anyone in the office knowing that it was happening. In fact, it took an information warfare organization in Canada more than a year to unravel the chain of controlling computers and track who is behind the GhostNet attack to the end of the trail. The chain, in fact, petered out in servers on Hainan Island off the coast of China, which, perhaps not coincidentally, is also the home of one of the People's Liberation Army's signals intelligence organizations. The Chinese government vehemently denied that it was responsible for this intrusion. Another example was the Chinese attack on the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, another successful spear phishing expedition. Sadly, for the U.S. government, OPM manages the security clearance process for federal employees. As a result, it's thought highly likely that every file associated with the OPM-managed security clearance process since 2000 was exposed. That's data on roughly 22.1 million people who work in America's security community, and it includes at least 5 million sets of fingerprints, as well as the detailed financial and health records of all of these employees, as well as those of their spouses. In short, it is the greatest espionage surveillance coup of all time. Now, there's one other concept I want to share with you today: the idea of a zero-day vulnerability. A zero-day exploit is one that becomes known on the same day the attacker uses it to take advantage of someone. Hence, we say that it works on the 0th day, or that there are 0 days between when the vulnerability is discovered and used. Let me explain that a bit more. In cyberspace, most vulnerabilities are gaps in programming code that, when discovered, can be exploited by outsiders. After all, most operating programs have tens of thousands of lines of code in them. Really big programs, like the operating system for Windows or Apple's computer, have millions of lines of code. It is completely unsurprising that sometimes mistakes creep into the code, mistakes that can be exploited by malicious outsiders. These vulnerabilities go by obscure technical names like SQL injection and TDL rootkit vulnerability. The names almost don't matter, and for the average user, the details aren't particularly interesting. What matters is that particular flaws in the code allow outsiders to force the code to do unanticipated things, often with some really adverse consequences. But once the vulnerability is exposed and exploited, software designers can also fix it. That's why software security firms are constantly shipping updates to your computer, and software developers are constantly recommending that users download patches for their software. They are providing you with the fixes to vulnerabilities that have recently been discovered, most often because some malicious actor has taken advantage of them. For this reason, new vulnerabilities, ones that have not been exploited before, are a valuable commodity for bad actors. The intruders save them up and use them for important attacks because they're unlikely to have been patched and almost surely will work. These zero-day exploits are the coin of the realm. Using one of them in an attack is standard in more sophisticated attacks. Two is a little profligate. A 2011 attack on Iran's nuclear production facility that has been attributed to the United States used 4 of them, a measure of the sophistication of the attackers and of their determination. So, who would do such a thing, and why? What, after all, is the use to China of the Anthem hack? If they aren't stealing money, and apparently they're not, why did they go to the effort? The answer lies in the nature of the cyber domain. For one of its characteristics is that it doesn't come with a map, and its geography is changing all the time. Data connections are created and dropped on a daily basis. New servers come online, old ones are taken off. New users get new user IDs, and new operating systems are attached and detached on a near continuous basis. That means that a critical first step in any attack is mapping the environment. Before the attack on Iran's nuclear program occurred, a larger data mapping program known as FLAME spent months and perhaps years reportedly building a picture of the Iranian network. The same objective lies, I think, behind the exploitation of Anthem, and a similar exploitation of the US Postal Service, where the Chinese are believed to have harvested the email addresses and personal data on post office employees. We don't think the postal employees were the target. They were a vehicle to a different, more significant target. By contrast, the hack of OPM was much more of a classical espionage attack. With the data from that intrusion, China now knows the names of almost everyone in America who has a security clearance, including me. That means 2 things. First, it makes it very much harder for the US to stage covert operations when the identity of many of its spies is already known to the Chinese. Second, it means that the Chinese now have information about those who work in our intelligence and law enforcement communities that they can use to extort cooperation from them upon threat of public exposure. Here's another good example of how this sort of foreign surveillance works. In December 2011, the FBI told the US Chamber of Commerce that the Chamber's servers had been penetrated by intrusions from China. Until the FBI told them, the Chamber had no idea it had been compromised. Now, most analysts think that the Chamber was attacked as a way of getting at other major American companies. Using the email addresses and other personal information harvested from the Chamber of Commerce, the intruders would be better able to craft a sophisticated spear phishing attack against the CEOs, CFOs, and CIOs of the Fortune 500. We might never learn how successful those follow-on attacks are, but they seemed to be inevitable. Indeed, as Mike McConnell, who served as Director of National Intelligence under President George W. Bush, has said, the Chinese have penetrated every major corporation of any consequence in the United States and taken information. We've never, ever not found Chinese malware. In other words, the espionage and surveillance of average Americans is usually just a tactic aimed at a larger strategic objective. Chinese attacks on OPM, Anthem, or the U.S. Chamber of Commerce are stepping stones to bigger and better things. It is a source of both traditional national security intelligence and, in the end, also a means of stealing intellectual property and advancing the Chinese economy. The American security companies Mandiant, now owned by FireEye, and CrowdStrike have actually identified two arms of the People's Liberation Army, known by their military unit cover designations as Units 61398 and 61486, as special operations aimed at hacking foreign economies. It appears from the outside that these units are tasked with the object of attacking and intruding into the systems and databases of business enterprises and research institutions in order to steal trade secrets, technical talents, and any useful information from and through the Internet. In Unit 61398 alone, several hundred operators worked for more than 5 years, penetrated more than 140 known corporate and government systems, and stole more than 6.5 terabytes of data, according to FireEye. Nearly 90% of the victims were in English-speaking countries, and nearly 98% of the attacks were based on systems using a simplified Chinese language input. The Chinese government, of course, has denied everything. The FBI has warned U.S. healthcare companies specifically that malicious threat actors were targeting them in an attempt to steal intellectual property and personally identifiable information. However, FireEye says the Chinese government is expanding the scope of its cyber operations, and Chinese-based advanced threat actors are keen to acquire data about how businesses operate, not just about how they make their products. It revealed that Chinese hacker groups had also systematically stolen data and information on U.S. medical device manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies as well. In yet another chilling hack, the security firm RSA was penetrated by an intrusion that compromised the company's secure ID system. The secure ID system was, at the time, the single most common piece of security hardware in use by banks and private companies. Maybe you've seen one. It's that little token that periodically generates random 6-digit numbers. So when you go to log into your bank or access your company's servers from off-site, in addition to your regular login, your username and password, you're also asked to type in your 6-digit number, which will be matched against the one held by the company or the bank you're trying to connect to. If they match, you're considered authentic. If they don't, then the company or bank thinks that your password has been compromised. So secure ID tokens are an important extra layer of security. Though details of the attack are unclear, the intruders apparently compromised the random number generation algorithm so that they'd be able to infiltrate companies that use the RSA Secure ID token. And a few weeks later, Lockheed Martin was attacked by someone using the stolen RSA data who attempted remote access to their system. This attack was reported to have been thwarted, but the focus on a defense contractor rather than on a bank seemed to be an indication that the RSA hack might have been undertaken by a sovereign nation rather than cybercriminals, since cybercriminals might have been more inclined to use the data to break into a bank account instead. China denied responsibility for the RSA attack as well. But of the 334 command and control servers used by the malware, 299 were located in China. In fact, except for one mistake that China apologized for, the Chinese have denied any role in all of the attacks we've been discussing, as well as dozens of others known attacks that I haven't listed. What are we going to make of these Chinese activities? How should we assess them? Are they significant threats? Should we credit the routine denials that China makes, disclaiming responsibility? Well, first, I think there is little basis for accepting China's denials of awareness and responsibility. I was particularly amused by a propaganda error by the government a couple of years ago. Chinese news was broadcasting a story about China's military system on their TV. It was typical fare, a summary of new things that the military was doing and such. But suddenly, in the midst of the story, there was a segment on cyber war. And that segment included footage showing a computer screen. And on the screen itself, you could see cyber attack commands directing an incursion against a server in the United States. Whoops! Shortly after Western news outlets noticed the TV segment and translated it, the government recognized its mistake and the video was pulled from Chinese websites. Nobody who seriously studies the issue doubts that the attacks on American systems are part of a systematic espionage campaign that could not really occur without Chinese state approval. Second, we should think about how one should respond to this sort of activity, if at all. The response, if any, must come from the US government. The American private sector has virtually no leverage to use to modify Chinese behavior. To date, we've seen at least two different types of US government action in an effort to restrain Chinese surveillance and espionage. The first is the deployment of the American criminal system. For instance, in one well-publicized case, the Department of Justice indicted 5 Chinese military hackers who were believed to be part of Unit 61398. They were charged with computer hacking, economic espionage, and other offenses directed at 6 victims in the U.S. nuclear power, metals, and solar products industry. This was the first time that charges were brought for cyber offenses against individuals presumed to be acting on behalf of a nation-state. Needless to say, China did not agree to extradite the 5 individuals, and there seems to be no real prospect that they will be brought to trial. And so, the U.S. government has turned to a broader tool, economic sanctions. The President issued an executive order entitled Blocking the Property of Certain Persons Engaged in Significant Malicious Cyber-Enabled Activities. Under this directive, the Treasury Department was authorized to freeze the assets of any individual or entity found to be responsible for or complicit in cyber-enabled activities that are reasonably likely to result in or have materially contributed to a significant threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economic, health, or financial stability of the United States. In announcing this policy, the White House said that hackers and their sponsors from China, Russia, and Iran were the targets of the sanctions. Initially, no sanctions were imposed, as the White House seemed to hope that the mere threat of sanctions would cause a change in behavior. One can at least hope. All of which leaves us with one final question. If these exploits are the ones we can identify, typically after the fact, what about the ones we're missing?